Wars are not won by arsenals. They are won by fuel capacity. A tank without diesel is scrap metal. A supply convoy without fuel is immobile. A command post without generators goes dark. Venezuela sits on some of the world's largest oil reserves, yet it cannot sustain a modern war beyond weeks, perhaps days. The reason is not lack of weapons. It is a diesel deficit that collapses military capability before the first shot matters. The common assumption: Venezuela has oil, therefore fuel is not a constraint. This assumes oil in the ground equals fuel at the front. It does not. Oil is a raw material. Diesel is a refined product. The gap between the two determines whether a military can move, sustain, and operate. Venezuela's oil reserves are measured in billions of barrels. But reserves do not power trucks, refineries do. And Venezuela's refining infrastructure has degraded to the point where domestic diesel production cannot meet peacetime demand, let alone wartime consumption. This is not a political failure, it is a systems failure. And systems failures compound under stress. Diesel is the backbone of military logistics. It powers transport trucks that move ammunition, food, water, and personnel. It fuels armored vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery. It runs generators that sustain command posts, field hospitals, and communication networks. Gasoline powers light vehicles and aircraft, but the logistical mass of an army moves on diesel. Without diesel, an army becomes a static entity. Supply lines freeze. Armor becomes defensive positions. Command collapses into isolated pockets. Diesel is not optional. It is the enabling resource that determines whether a military can project power or merely occupy ground. Venezuela produces heavy crude, thick, sulfur-rich oil that requires complex refining to convert into usable diesel. Refining capacity depends on functional equipment, skilled labor, and consistent input materials. Venezuela's refineries have experienced cascading degradation, maintenance lapses, loss of technical expertise, shortages of catalysts and additives. Modern refining is not just turning a valve. It requires chemical precision, temperature control, and continuous monitoring. When these systems fail, output drops, quality degrades, production becomes erratic. The result? Venezuela imports diesel despite sitting on oil reserves. It cannot produce enough domestically to meet civilian and military needs simultaneously, and imports require payment, supply chains, and willing sellers, all of which become constrained under wartime conditions. Consider a mobilized force of 30,000 personnel conducting active operations. Estimate fuel consumption: 100 transport trucks, each burning approximately 30 liters per 100 kilometers under combat load. 50 armored vehicles consuming between 200 and 400 liters per 100 kilometers. 200 generators running continuously for command, communications, and sustainment. Daily diesel consumption approaches hundreds of thousands of liters. Weekly consumption exceeds 1 million liters. Stockpiles that appear sufficient for months in peacetime evaporate in weeks under operational tempo. This is not a battle calculus. It is a sustainment calculus. The question is not whether forces can fight today. The question is whether they can fight next week and the week after. Fuel determines the answer. Sanctions targeting Venezuela's energy sector restrict access to refining components, additives, and spare parts. These are not symbolic measures. They create compounding constraints: reduced refining efficiency due to equipment failures, inability to process heavy crude into high-grade diesel, and dependence on informal networks that cannot scale. Black market fuel exists, but it cannot support wartime consumption rates. Informal supply chains work for limited volumes. They collapse under sustained, large-scale demand. The result? Venezuela's military operates on a fuel budget that shrinks under pressure. There is no reserve capacity. There is no surge option. Isolation does not need to eliminate all fuel. It only needs to prevent sustainable production, and it has. Fuel constraints create cascading failures. First, mobility degrades. Forces become road-bound, predictable, vulnerable. Second, readiness collapses. Units ration fuel, reducing training, maintenance, and preparedness. Third, command and control fragments. Generators fail, communications degrade, coordination breaks down. These failures occur before combat intensity peaks. They are not caused by enemy action, they are caused by internal consumption. A military that cannot sustain its own operations cannot project power. It can defend fixed positions, it can conduct limited raids, but it cannot execute sustained campaigns. Venezuela's military constraint is not weapons. It is fuel burn rate versus production capacity, and the math does not close. The business of war lesson. Energy determines sustainment. Sustainment determines power. Oil reserves are a potential. Diesel production is a capability. The gap between them defines what a military can and cannot do. Venezuela is not a military threat limited by doctrine or training. It is a logistics-limited state, constrained by fuel infrastructure. The war it cannot fight is not the one it loses in battle. It is the one it cannot sustain long enough to fight.